Okay, thanks all for coming out today. It's good to see you here in the latest instalment of our Doornink lecture series on disinformation and misinformation. We are, of course, very grateful for her support of this series. So I'd like to say a special thank you, Barbara, for doing that. And we're very lucky today. We've got an excellent speaker to talk about health communication, but specifically in the realm of misinformation and that. I'd like to introduce Professor Emily Vraga. I did say it correctly, so that's great. Who is the Don and Carol Larson Professor of Health Communication at the University of Minnesota's Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Her research tests methods to identify and correct health misinformation on social media, to build trust and allies, to promote high quality information, and to encourage attention to more diverse content online. Vraga has published over 100 journal articles and book chapters and co-authored a book on correcting misinformation on social media. Her work has been supported by the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, and her work has informed efforts to improve information integrity online. Please join me in welcoming Emily Vraga.
And thank you all for inviting me here today. I'm really excited to talk to you about a lot of things that came out of the book that I published last year with Letitia Bodie, focusing specifically not just on the problem of misinformation, but hopefully offering a more optimistic take on some of the things that we can do. So with that, there's kind of this assumption, this recognition that misinformation was a major problem. So this is from 2026, where if you look at the short-term problems confronting kind of the world, according to the World Economic Forum, mis and disinformation comes in at number 2 as the short-term risk. The WHO has recognized this as well. They've started in 2020 doing this infodemic management, where they're really focusing on thinking about misinformation as part of a larger information environment, where it's hard to know what's true and false, and misinformation just makes that even harder. The US government had recognized that misinformation was a real problem, and so we had the Surgeon General's report in 2022 about confronting health misinformation and the importance of that. The US Department of State likewise said disarming disinformation is our shared responsibility. And Homeland Security in 2018 was also concerned about false information, in this case in the context of emergencies, but kind of this broad recognition that this is something we need to be concerned with. Now, we can point our fingers to a lot of different people, a lot of different actors. One of our most favorite to point to is social media. Social media is the culprit. They are the reason that we have misinformation running rampant. And so if you survey people around the world, you can see that this is the share of internet users who see misinformation on the internet as a threat. And it ranges kind of from low amounts in some countries to, in the US, most of Europe, Africa, South America, we're at majorities of people saying that this is a real problem. And for a while, social media companies kind of agreed. So perhaps the most prominent example is in early 2020, as we entered the COVID-19 pandemic, we have a joint industry statement where all the social media platforms say we are going to work together to make sure that you're getting accurate information to address misinformation on our platforms. And so you have all of these different social media companies promoting the things that they're doing to address misinformation. We'll come back to that in a moment. So everyone's saying it's social media. Social media is at fault. Even the platforms are kind of, yeah, we have a problem. But there's a lot of things about social media that actually make it a place where it could be an opportunity to help people, to make sure that they're getting more accurate information, right? Like, social media is not entirely bad. So what about social media can we leverage to actually make people less misinformed and more accurate? And so this is where we introduce the idea of observed correction. Observed correction has 3 components to it. First, you need a direct response. Second, you need accurate information. And third, you need witnesses. So I'll kind of walk through each of those in turn. So what do I mean by a direct response? And this is one that we've wrestled with a lot. Because anything that you say that's accurate theoretically is corrective in nature. Theoretically, if I say that the earth is round, if you thought maybe perhaps it isn't, you now have accurate information and hopefully know the earth is in fact round. But that also makes it really challenging as a thing to study because literally anything that's true could then be considered corrective. So to kind of narrow the scope and think about what do we mean by correction, we decided it has to be a direct response. So here's an example from Reddit. Somebody posting, I don't care if I get hate, but my favorite Paper Mario Boss song, and people responding saying that they're inaccurate. Now here we do have, in fact, a direct response. We have somebody posting something and two people directly responding to that with their own beliefs on it. But this is not observed correction because it's very deliberately about opinion, right? He says it's my opinion, or they say it's their opinion. And then we have some people responding, both kindly and unkindly. Everyone can have their own opinion. This is not observed correction. This is opinion. This is just debate. This is conversation. It's interesting. It's worth studying, but it is not observed correction. Yeah.
Oh, I was curious. So is that from like Reddit?
Yes, this is from Reddit from a while ago. Reddit looked different.
Yeah, because it looks like a YouTube comment section.
Yep, this one happens to be Reddit. So then here's some examples of corrections that we observed on our own social media feeds. So here we have, somebody saying, saying they're a doctor and claiming that the HPV jab does not reduce cancer, it increases cervical cancer, right? And we have somebody responding directly saying this is absolutely not true. HPV prevents cancer. Women who receive it are giving the facts, right? This is observed correction because we have somebody saying something wrong and we have somebody responding with the facts. But the thing about social media in particular is it enhances the ability for these kinds of conversations to happen in places where others can see them. So when we think about correction, we often think, it's pointless. It's never going to work. I'm never going to be able to convince that person who believes this wrong thing that, in fact, they're wrong. I'm not going to be able to convince them of the truth. And there's both evidence that that is harder and that it can work. But what we wanted to say is thinking about social media specifically, what happens in these conversations is, you're right. The person you're talking to has all of these reasons why they don't want to believe you. They cared enough about the topic to post on social media, and they publicly committed themselves to something that's false, both of which create resistance. But there's a whole lot of people witnessing this interaction, and they are not nearly as prepared to have their defenses raised, right? Motivated reasoning takes work. Defending your viewpoints takes work. And when you're on social media, people aren't really there to do work. They're there to do other things. So that affordance of social media, this audience, makes it more likely that the people seeing this are going to end up better informed because they don't have that same defensive mechanism, or at least it's not as strongly operative. So just a few more examples of this. You can see this across social media platforms. So here at the beginning of the pandemic, we have somebody saying that they're making themselves some vodka hand sanitizer. And actually you get Tito's responding saying, nope, please don't use our vodka for that. The CDC says you need 60% alcohol and we're not 60% alcohol. So always been one of my favorites when we have the brand engaged in this kind of correction. Here we have somebody complaining about the prices of Taco Bell burritos. If we raise minimum wage, it's going to be $38. And we have somebody on Twitter telling them, well, I live in DC and our minimum wage is $15 and it's not that. In some ways, Reddit is actually one of the best places for this because on Reddit, it has this democratic structure where we are upvoting accurate information. So here we have somebody tweeting or posting a tweet. So we see this kind of cross-platform movement, and we see two different ways in which this is being corrected. First, somebody is pointing out that you are posting to our satire or our political means, and they're saying this is satire, right? Like this is obviously a joke. This is not real. Don't believe it. We also have people helpfully pointing out, look, here's some fact checks. This is totally false. And we have other people saying, upvoting this and making sure that the top thing you see when you see this piece of potentially misinformation, something that could mislead you, is that, hey, this is totally false, right? So we have people working together as a community to promote accurate information and making sure no one is misled by this misinformation. So that all sounds lovely. Does it actually work, right? So how did we do this? We report on 8 data collections from 2016 to 2022. And we have 24 experimental tests. So in each case, we have some feature of correction that matches our definition, and we compare it to control where people get no information on the topic. And that's really important to us because one of the criticisms of observed correction is that if you engage with the misinformation, you are promoting it, you are making sure more people see it. So if it just brings you back to baseline, makes it so that it's like, doesn't matter if you saw the misinformation or not, maybe it's not worth doing. The question is, can we make people even better off when they've seen misinformation with correction versus having seen nothing on the topic? And so we do use simulated feeds to do this. Here's an example of a Twitter stimulus. Again, this is from 2016. And you have here the CDC and Dave Wilson responding to this misinformation from Tyler Johnson. We did it on Facebook Live. We've done it on Facebook. This was one of the more interesting ones because we had this video sharing misinformation, and then we have these scrolling comments where people are responding using some of these best practices and trying to rebut that misinformation. So, $1 million question, does it work? Yes, it does, thank goodness. That made us very happy to see this. So again, this is percent change in accuracy compared to seeing nothing. So seeing misinformation plus correction leaves you more accurate on this topic than if you'd seen nothing at all. This worked in 22 out of 24 cases and worked across a variety of health topics, including whether Zika was caused by GMO mosquitoes, whether fluoride in your drinking water was going to reduce intelligence, whether GMOs are going to make you sick. It worked exceptionally well for raw milk and whether it's more nutritious and safer than pasteurized milk. For COVID-19, and then kind of 2 failures, one around flu vaccination and one around whether sunscreens are going to cause cancer. And part of what happened, especially in this case, is recall is hard. We tried to make these feeds as realistic as possible, having a lot of different content associated with it. So in that sunscreen case, they're watching a 2-minute video of a woman claiming to be a doctor and saying all of these things about sunscreen, that it causes cancer, that it damages your DNA. And they're expected to kind of see these little things on the side, scrolling comments. And when we asked people, about half of them said, I didn't even see it, right? So the next thing we did was say, well, let's just limit it to people who remembered what the corrections actually said. And here we get much stronger effects, right? We are able to boost accuracy when people actually see the corrections, which I think is important to reflect on both in the context of, one, on social media, a lot of people miss them. So that first piece of evidence is really important. It can work even taking into account a lot of people don't see them. And 2, it can work even better if we can think of ways to make these more visible. So why are we so focused on correction of all the different things we can do? First, as I just said, it's effective. It is not a panacea, it is not solving the misinformation problem, but it can make people a little bit more accurate, and sometimes that's what we need. Second, it's empowering. It's giving people power to do this. It's saying, hey, you're a social media user, you're unhappy with misinformation online. What can you do to make the information environment better? As you saw from these examples, social media looks really different now than when we started doing this. As people move into other social media platforms, for example, if they move into spaces like WhatsApp or Signal, where we don't have these large public audiences, but much smaller audiences we can't monitor, some of the other tools just aren't going to operate there. But as long as there are people, you have the potential to do this. As long as you have people willing to do this. So that's kind of the next question. Where do corrections come from? So when we think about different people who can correct, we can think about a lot of different agents. We can think about the platforms themselves, and they can take steps to mitigate, to moderate, to respond to misinformation. We can think about the policies that are enacted that change this misinformation landscape, the incentives for it or the disincentives. We can think about various professionals. So I do a lot of health communication. Health professionals, what can the CDC be doing to mitigate misinformation? Journalists, fact checkers, what can they be doing? But I'm going to focus today on the public. What can we be doing? What can individual users of social media be doing? So the question becomes, does the public actually do this? Theoretically, it works. Do people do it? And so we did 32 interviews with social media users in the summer of 2022, and the big takeaway was no. Mostly they wanted to tell us, no, we didn't do this, right? And one of the things that was really interesting is we went into these interviews trying to deliberately select people who said they did this and who said they didn't. And what we found is no matter what they told us in the survey, when we actually talked to them, they all ended up sounding the same. They were conflicted about whether or not to do it. So first off, why didn't they? What were their reasons? The first is the thing that we all think, it just isn't gonna work. Right? So you have Lisa saying, like, what's the point? They're just going to think what they think. Whatever I say is not going to matter. This is not an effective solution. Now, this is an interesting one because it does work. And so that gives us an opportunity. But by and large, the perception is like, this is futile. And why would I spend my time doing it? When they get past that, they wanted to tell us all about the pain involved in doing it. And so we have these incredibly moving stories of people being afraid to do this, being afraid to post on social media because they're going to have a toxic community coming after them. And this is a pain reflected among social media users. When we talk with health professionals and journalists, they have this, except even more heightened because they're so much more public. They're really afraid about threats, about violence. Sometimes it's not about this kind of diffuse sense of violence, but about personal relationships. So Vince tells us that I'm not getting involved. I haven't lost a single friend because I don't post about anything interesting. One that always stuck with me is I spoke with someone, we'll call him Gaston, and he told me about trying to correct someone on social media. He worked for a pharmaceutical company and his grandmother had just died from cancer. And his friend of a decade or more had posted on social media that cancer, they had the cures for cancer and they just weren't, promoting it because they wanted to make money. And he's like, I work for a pharmaceutical company. If there was a cure for cancer, my grandmother would be with me. And he lost that friendship. They never talked again. So they all had these experiences of trying to do this and it was painful. It was deeply painful on a personal level. And it's costly, it's hard, right? Like Julia just says, I have more important things to do. I can't waste my time on 500 comment threads. So there's a lot of reasons why people aren't going to do this. And yet, we know that they do. So one important study looking at kind of COVID misinformation in the early days of the pandemic found that 96% of corrections to COVID misinformation came from what they called concerned citizens, just ordinary people. We asked people too, like, have you seen this happen? Have you seen someone else being corrected on social media in the past week? And here we're looking at both COVID and politics. We're looking in 2020, we're looking at 2021. And around half are saying, yeah, this is something I see happening. And it's not just the US. The US is a little bit higher, but looking around the world, the same thing. People tell us over and over again, this is something we see happening. And it's certainly something that we saw happening on our own feed. So where is that disconnect? And that's because sometimes people do correct. So even after so many of them would tell us, I would never do this. I would absolutely never correct. Or I've had these painful stories about the time I did it and it went terribly wrong. Often those same people would come back to us and explain, and yet here's a time I did, or here's a time I would. And when they did, they usually talked about one of four things. One, they talked about observed correction. I mean, they didn't use that word. Of course they didn't use that word. But they were telling us that it's not about the person I'm correcting, but it's about the broader community. It's about representing and standing up for truth and bringing up for facts, because it's not just for him, it's for others who might see this. So this recognition of a broader community. A deep concern that misinformation is harmful, right? So Fiona was one of the people who most adamantly told me, like, no, never, would never do this. But she also told me this. She also told me if it's really, really bad, I will march myself in there, right? So they had both of these things happening. When they felt confident. So Ermine was a small business owner and she's just like, that's something I know about. And if people are going to misrepresent my experiences, I'm going to be there speaking truth. I'm going to be there making sure people are left with the right impression. And lastly, this kind of sense of duty, right? Some people talked about this. Harold says it was a now or never kind of moment where I felt compelled. I wanted to fight for the version of reality that I think is truth. And so we have all of these reasons why even the most reluctant people talked about scenarios in which they had or would correct. And when we asked people in a survey, a lot more people said they would. And do I think that 40% of people corrected misinformation on social media in the last week? No, I do not believe them. But the fact they want to tell me that tells me something really important about social norms. We only say socially desirable things when we think that others like them, when we think this is something that is valued. Otherwise, why would I pretend I do something I might not do? So ultimately, for members of the public, we do see that they're willing to sometimes respond. They are giving accurate information. What often they did is took it elsewhere. They would say, I would call my friend, I would take it offline, I would go to Messenger. So a lot more people are willing to do this in private spaces, which can be really powerful and really important, but leaves out a lot of people who are left with misimpressions. So kind of the last question. People say they want to do this in some scenarios, but are really afraid of all of these different things. We know it can work, but it only works, it's only scalable if we're all willing to do this. So can we motivate people to correct? So if we think about kind of the reasons they told us, the barriers and the benefits, they told us about some of these benefits, but they're often outweighed by very visceral experiences with it. So the question becomes, can we take some of those and reinforce them? So if they think maybe norms aren't supportive of this, can I, or maybe it doesn't work, can I take those and actually say, you know what? People say they do this, people say they like this. And if you don't think it works, we have a lot of evidence that it actually does. If we tell people of that, can it help? We can't really do anything about broken relationships. It's just a reality of it. And for safety, it will never be a benefit. But can we reassure people? Can we make them think that maybe these environments are more safe? So we did an experiment in 2023 where we gave them these little, what we called Facebook ads, where we took each of these ideas. Does it work? Do people like it? For safety, we said that Facebook was cracking down on trolls, right? Like they were trying to reduce them on their platform, because there are some studies on Reddit, for example, that found that actually did work. So we showed them that, and then we showed them a screenshot of misinformation. And we were very deliberate in picking misinformation. The misinformation that sunscreen changes your DNA, don't use it. And we picked this because if we go back to, again, why people correct, one, they had to perceive it was harmful, right? And this is one that is very harmful. If people are not using sunscreen because they're worried about these adverse health effects, they're putting themselves at risk. Two, they had to have expertise or knowledge. Most people know that this is not true, right? Our survey suggested 86% of people were like, no, this is definitely false, right? So they had the knowledge they needed. They didn't have to do any research. And we made it look like there's an audience. So we tried to put it right in this sweet spot. And it's worth noting that sweet spot can be really small. The places where people have all of these things, a perception of an audience who can be harmed, a perception that they know enough to correct. Because people were like, I will only correct if I'm 100% certain. One person said 80%, and that's the lowest we got. Everyone else, it was like 100%, 95%. So how likely would you be to respond to this post? So compared to a control condition where they had a message about texting and driving, what we see is when we talk about efficacy, people were more likely to say they're correct. So first off, most people did not want to respond. Most people didn't want to. So we start with a very low base level, about 20%. But we got that up to closer to 30% when we told them that this works and that it works especially well for bigger audiences. And same deal when we talked about norms, that people think people should do it and that people actually do this. So stressing these two things can help. The trolling one did not work. I don't know if they just didn't think it was going, they didn't believe us, it wasn't effective. Maybe they weren't worried about specific trolls, but kind of this bigger, larger landscape. But we can, in fact, with a pretty small, simple campaign, encourage people, more people, to say they would correct. So to kind of conclude, observed correction is effective, right? Again, not solving it, making things a little bit better. And sometimes in the moment, all we can do is make things a little bit better. But it is not reaching its full potential, in part because of actual misperceptions. So when we asked people in 2024 if they like correction, we get, this is a strongly agree, strongly disagree, mean of around 5, right? The majority of people say they like it. But when we ask them, do other people like it? We see this pretty big gap. They think more people dislike it than like it. And that kind of goes back to the motivating correction experiment as well. If you tell people that this is something that is valued, or remind people that there are these social norms, maybe we can get more people involved. But I also have to recognize where we are in this moment. So this is looking at survey data from the past 70 years now, and looking at people's willingness to speak out, or in this case, unwillingness to speak one's mind. And what we see is in the past decade, this number is higher than it's been in kind of recent history. And so there's a lot of reasons for that. And this only goes till 2023. And so there's a lot of reasons why people don't want to do this. It is both personal fears about these broken relationships. It is also a more diffuse fear about what could happen if you do this, the potential risks to doing it. And so we need to think about what changes to our information environment are actually needed so that people feel safe doing this, because no one should be doing something they feel unsafe doing. And lastly, always have to stress, this is only part of the solution, right? We are not going to completely get rid of misinformation. It has been with us as long as people communicate, because all it means is we're wrong. I get things wrong all the time, and I'm sure you do too. And so all of us, whether we study misinformation for a living or not, have shared misinformation. And so we need to build social norms around saying you're wrong is okay. And when somebody tells you you're wrong, that's a caring behavior. That is something we're meant to be doing. Now, can we solve it? No. How do you prevent headaches? Here's a helpful guide with 6 things you can do, right? You should eat regular meals, you should drink plenty of water, you should get sleep, you should exercise. These are all wonderful things. I strongly encourage you to do them. And yet, we often fail at doing these things. We get headaches. And when we do, we acknowledge we need to do all these things. And we take aspirin or Tylenol, whatever it is. That's what correction is. Misinformation is going to persist even if we do a lot of other things, and we should do a lot of other things, but there will always be misinformation and we will always need correction for that reason. So when we started thinking about this, we thought of this as a Swiss cheese model. And I'm from Wisconsin, so this deeply appeals to me. Anything relating to cheese
No, not the dairy state, me.
is going to resonate. So we thought of it as like, well, each of these things are things we can do to reduce the amount of misinformation in the system. And at the end, we need correction because some will always sneak through. But where I've kind of ended is thinking instead about misinformation in this context, or correction in this context. Each of these layers are not separate. We need to melt them together because correction works when we have trust. And trust is something that is really hard right now, thinking about who we trust. It works when we already know what is good and bad information. It works when we have better understanding of the rhetorical tools that misinformation actors are likely to use. And so we need all of these solutions still. And correction is going to be part of that, and it is going to make all of those better and be made better by all of them. And lastly, I think it's worth stressing, some of this is coming down to us in part because a lot of those other layers are being excised. We have less of these other layers there. And so as social media platforms kind of turn to solutions that depend on users to do this kind of work, we need to understand both where it works, what we can do to make it more effective, and the reasons that people aren't doing it so that we can enable everyone, empower everyone to engage in the ways that feel safe and build more supportive, healthier communities. Thank you.
We've got almost 25 minutes for questions, if you'd just like to have at it. I'll lead off if I can.
Yeah, of course.
As that seems right. We had a conversation yesterday about sources of information, and let's take, for example, Maha. And that within the messages that are sent out, there are some that seem authoritatively correct that we can all get behind, yet nestled between them are maybe ones which we find somewhat ludicrous. How do you challenge people who sort of say, well, I've got all this information, they were right about this, so clearly they're right about the other thing. What sort of steps can we take with someone who's drunk the Kool-Aid?
No, I think that's a really good question. And that's back to where all of these different pieces need to fit together. Building credibility and building trust is not a one-shot solution. Part of the reason I think user corrections are really powerful is because those social ties are sometimes the thing that we need that grounds us when we're surrounded by these much larger communities, but are sometimes more distant from us. And so I think we have made this process more challenging by having a fragmented media environment where we can't all agree on who we can trust, but thinking about who your audience thinks is credible when you're trying to respond, thinking about ways you can validate what is true while pointing out what is false, and then back to just the not single day problem of how do we build norms in which correction is seen not as combative, not as cruel, not as conflictual, but as caring. And so I think that that's kind of one more piece to that.
Yeah, I'm sure you've already headed this direction, but have you considered how community notes or a similar mechanism can kind of like buffer that personal cost, I suppose?
Yeah, so that is one of the huge advantages of community notes is it gives people an opportunity to be empowered to make corrections in a way that is kind of secondhand, where they are not directly the face of the correction, and they cannot be held accountable in a sense. They cannot be directly targeted for it. So that's the huge benefit of community notes. The downside is the way in which it's implemented currently at X is they have what's called a bridging algorithm. So the only community notes that get published are ones that people who disagree generally agree on. And so community notes don't tend to get published on politicized issues, on polarized issues. Often they're just pointing out things like satire or lack of context. And so the way in which they're implemented has to be really thoughtfully done, because I think there are real advantages to it, but it also means that they're being outpaced and are rare.
Small follow-up. It's okay if you don't have the answer. Do you have an idea of how you could implement that? Perhaps.
That is challenging, because on the one hand, I'd see some value in the bridging algorithm. Otherwise, these could be very easy to game. But it also needs maybe, I guess, if it were me, I would have fact checkers helping, right? Like paid journalists and fact checkers whose job it is to help produce these community notes. And they've already been doing a lot of this work and could do so in ways that protects them, because we talked to fact checkers and they had many of these same experiences. So I think that would be one of the best solutions. One that many of the social media companies are pursuing is using AI to produce these and generate them, which I think has promise as well as some real risks associated with it.
No idea where it would get the information from.
Professor V, guys, just call it
Yeah.
Professor V. So Professor V, I was gonna ask, sometimes I would say pretty much in most cases, do you think it's up to the person to accept, because it's up to that person to accept if whatever their, information that we're presenting to you, even though you and I know it's factual, that person can be like, even though if it's right, I still don't want to, accept it, right? Like I could say like, this is an iPhone, but this person will still think like, this is like a water bottle. And I know that this question sounds absurd, but in my time, when I was spending time in politics and that too, within the right, it was really hard to convince a lot of people, saying that, hey, this is how it was done in the past and it worked. Why don't we implement, this way as well, and of course I'm also open to, changes as well. An example, we have a math equation that if we use this old math equation, it'll take us hours to, solve a problem. But if we use this new math equation, it will get done faster. And if people, they still don't want to do it, partially because what I think is the issue is that everybody and all those mean comments, the one thing that they'll have in common is that they have the biggest ego. I think that the country, and I would say the world, we have an ego issue where you see it's not the attitude. It's nobody wants to accept, even though they're wrong, they don't want to accept, you see they're wrong. They always want to be I'm right, even if I have to, in some cases, kill you for it. It's fine. So that's really what I think is the problem.
So yeah, I think that's totally right. And it's part of the social norms, right? That is something we need to fundamentally think about what we value as a society, and saying we value truth saying we value people admitting when they're wrong. Like for example, when I think about punishing politicians for changing their mind, I think there's both real risks in doing that. You should change your mind if you're confronted with new, better information. So in kind of a micro sense, if somebody corrected me on social media, my response would be, thank you. I'm glad that I know this now, right? I would probably check that what they're saying is true, but like, if they're correct and I'm wrong, I want to model the best kind of behavior that I appreciate that you have helped me learn something today. And at a macro level, we need more people who are willing to do that because, and not feel badly about it, right? Like, again, we're all going to get things wrong. We do it all the time, and getting it right is just good. It's better. Yeah.
It seems like a lot of the misinformation I've seen lately on social media is the deep fake photo. And I'm wondering if that just complicates things and how that complicates things for corrections.
I think that's totally right. It complicates things because seeing is no longer believing. I think we're fundamentally grappling with a new reality where the things that markers we relied on as evidence of truthfulness are being compromised. To give a slightly optimistic spin, out of context and AI generated photos is one of the places where community notes might be a little more helpful, because those are the kinds of things that do get through the community notes. People like pointing out when something is manipulative in that way. But that's a place where we need much better education, much better kind of pre-bunking and inoculation, to enable these kinds of corrections, and probably policy also, because as much as I've focused on individuals and the ways in which we can contribute, I never want to be thought of as saying that it is our responsibility, right? It is something we can do, and I hope we do, to make information environments better, but it shouldn't be just on individuals to be running around fact checking things. We have jobs, we have other things to do.
Yeah. So piggyback off that a little bit, I'm curious your take on regulating social media platforms, and given what transpired recently, right, with information and misinformation and the harmful effects that then compound, I find it really hard. I can be out there doing everything in my power, but I'm like, we got to take down some of these companies that are just there for the money.
It's really a challenging situation. So on the one hand, we talked to trust and safety professionals at a lot of these social media companies, and many of them talked about trying really hard to do it well. And defining misinformation is hard. Defining a global policy is really difficult, because what is appropriate in one country might not be appropriate or legal in other countries. And there is reasons why people do it. With that said, they also acknowledged social media companies make money off of engagement, whether that engagement is around true content or false content. And so that is a really difficult kind of mess to work through. On the one hand, even if they tried really hard, I don't know if we couldn't solve it. Back to, we always need correction. There will always be misinformation. But what can we do to incentivize them to try really hard? And I think that could be a combination of policy, that can be a combination of individuals making choices about which platforms they engage with. But we probably do need to think very carefully about what that regulation could look like. And I think it's worth looking around the world at different countries doing it differently. The EU has tried to do this much more so than the US, especially in kind of recent years. What's successful and what isn't working there, I think is really important to learn the lessons. Realistically, in the short term, I think we're going to continue moving away from platform moderation.
Thank you.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. So I did a survey, and in the survey I asked a couple questions. It's not a comprehensive study, just a couple of questions regarding why people wanted and did not want to correct misinformation online. I got quite a few answers about oh, what if it's just a joke? And I never thought about that. I thought about what you mentioned today, like I was too scared of losing the friend or whatsoever, but I never thought about that. But quite a few people answered that way, like something similar. Like, I don't know if it's just a joke or maybe it's just a joke. So I wonder how you think about this kind of answers. And I think it's like especially true very true when it comes to like I call it everyday misinformation, that it's really hard to tell whether it's just a joke to teasing people that their network, or it's like a true misinformation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And back to these social norms around like we don't call each other out. And so I think one, that makes total sense that that's a whole nother layer for people to kind of work through, and they don't want to be criticizing someone for satire, for example. But on the other hand, I think it's important to stress that people might not recognize that. So The Onion is a satirical newspaper from Wisconsin. There's all these really hilarious stories of people thinking The Onion is real and getting themselves into trouble by, sharing that publicly. So I think back to like, there might be ways where we can be supportive and still also make sure that we say things like, oh, I don't know if you meant this as a joke, but just so everyone knows, The Onion is satirical, right? Like, or I love The Onion, by the way, it's a fake news. It's fake, the original fake news, right? So I don't know if I can answer your question fully, other than there is both this deep conflict in people about what we should do about this. The desire to do something is really strong, as well as the reasons why they don't. And that's another reason potentially why they wouldn't. And so how can we rebuild social norms around this is something that we want to do. This is something that is protective. This is something that's valuable. And looking to Reddit, I think, is also very instructive for that. So Jen Forrestel has this really great book about how you design for democracy, I think it's called. And she talks about Reddit being one of these platforms where they've implemented, a lot of the subreddits have implemented spaces where this is valued and you see it happening. I'm a Reddit user, and some of my subreddits, I see this almost every week where somebody has shared something wrong and the community responds because that is how that community is built. So we have instances where this can work. How do we make sure those instances are, how do we make more of those places, more of those communities where it is working?
Thank you.
At the risk of hogging things, I do have another question. We've only just recently met, but you may not be surprised to learn that I'm a bit of an Uber corrector. Now I'm Gen X, so it's all on Facebook. And I have two approaches, and they often don't work, or they do work. And I wondered if you had some thoughts about it. The first one is I have some ex-family members who post some crazy stuff. And so what I do with them, because they're older, and I don't want to sort of upset them too much, but I first of all, I think, well, that doesn't look correct to me. So I research it, I find the Snopes article or something that will debunk it, and I post that. I say, I don't think this is true, and I post it. And that's nice, but they also are a little bit, yeah, that's Snopes. So there's that one type, but it doesn't annoy them. They don't unfriend me, and we still have some bit of a dialogue. But then on the other times, it's where I know something a lot about, and so I respond. And I can see that maybe my tone doesn't work very well. So I say, well, actually, this is this. I know these things are true, and blah, blah, blah. I do the response to their post. And then the amount of times I get, oh, just bugger off, you're just a know-it-all. And so I think the tone in how you respond is tricky. And I haven't got my tone right, clearly. But I wonder if you have some tips about how do you manage it in a way that doesn't immediately become the confrontation, doesn't immediately become the, oh, you just got my back up, let's have a fight about this now.
So I would say two things. First, when you say it works or doesn't work, most of us are thinking about the person we tried to correct. And whether it worked for them is separate from whether it worked for the people who saw your interaction. And so that is kind of an important point to keep in mind, that you might have failed with the person that you directly responded to and yet improved the community who saw it. Second, to your point about tone, that is challenging, right? I think it really depends on the relationship, and the stronger the relationship, the better chance you have of figuring out the right tone and the right source. So maybe for some people, Snopes is not going to convince them. Maybe you need to find a fact check from Fox News, or you need to find evidence from a local newspaper that they maybe feel deeply committed to. I have a lot of relatives in Minnesota, and they don't believe the news, like the news media, but they have at least some little trust in Minnesota Public Radio because they've listened to it for years. So like, I'm going to get further with them when I use that source than if I used the New York Times. And then lastly, tone is tough, right? Like tone is tough. And I would say thinking both about how can I make sure that I'm coming across as empathetic, as supportive, as understanding can be really helpful for managing that relationship. What's interesting is tone doesn't seem to matter as much for the observers. Like they just want the accurate information. And if you're kind of a jerk, they probably don't like you for it, but they still update their beliefs.
Good. I really like you address the question more deeply of what if it's all a deep fake, or particularly a sense that what you're hoping for is kind of individual responses to something which in fact may be, you may have a massive actor there.
Yes.
That is in fact doing whatever it can to make sure that what you want to do is countered,
Yeah.
that it is deep sixed, that it makes somebody money but not you. I'm sort of curious about that kind of concern.
Yeah, I think that's totally valid. So the Center for Countering Digital Hate did this really informative report back in 2021 maybe, and they found that the majority of vaccine misinformation on social media originated from 12 accounts, right? So there are powerful disinformation actors who can make a lot of money out of spreading things that benefit them, whether it's financially, whether it's politically, whether it's socially or professionally. Like there's reasons people spread it. And so recognizing that and thinking about that as we think about how to respond to misinformation is really important. The other thing that I'll say, and the strength of this is even on these really controversial topics, for the most part, there are more people who are accurate than are not. And there are more people who, the loud, often toxic people aren't as many as you think. And there's reasons for that, right? Like being awful is salient. So I think specifically, we talked to health communicators who were posting about and responding to misinformation online. And they would say things like, oh, I knew the bad actors. I recognized them. I always kind of knew. And I'd get one or two awful comments. I don't want to minimize the pain that they felt in having to confront that. But they would also talk about, I'd get hundreds of people, right? I get a few awful comments and I get hundreds of people sending me thank you, sending me hearts, reassuring me, thanking me for standing up for health and science. And so like back to those norms, if we kind of cede the public sphere to the loud, obnoxious people who have these motivations to silence other people, we're giving them more power than they would have otherwise had. And I'm not going to say that this is easy. I'm not going to say that I don't want anyone to ever feel compelled to go into a space they feel unsafe. We need to think about balancing that with mental health and physical and emotional safety as well. But also just thinking about how can we empower the many of us who want accuracy, who want science, who want truth, to be willing to stand up for it in ways when the other side is willing to be kind of hateful sometimes.
It strikes me that if you constantly have a sense of the individuals who are responsible, really in some ways sort of neglecting the fact that you have these massive nations and institutions that are doing whatever they can to make sure that your concerns are undercut. And let me just you mentioned the health issue. I'm just curious about responses that will in some way address, for example, the current federal administration's doing a whole series of, it's not just individuals of a certain actor who is, or not just 12 that are producing, there's in fact, an administration in this country and in other countries that are working at it. And I guess my concern would be how the leverage you're talking about, I guess would start with is it really important that you are always, you can't do anything if you're feeling unsafe about it? That strikes me that you never get any real change by taking that out.
I think you're right? So back to these different layers. This is one layer and it's not meant, it will never solve misinformation. And we do need structural changes. We do need maybe platform level changes. None of that is going to, it's never, I don't think we can correct our way out of this. But I also think that users do have a lot of power, and we have that reflected in lots of ways. We have that reflected in our ability to not use platforms that don't have policies we like, or that create environments that are unhealthy or toxic. We have the ability to vote and to change our elected leaders. I'm from Minneapolis, and the community was unhappy with what was happening and tried their best to stand up for it. And did it prevent all, were they entirely successful? No. Did they do good? Yes. And so I think parsing that and recognizing the ways in which, no, this is not going to solve it, but this can help us get there. And how can we strengthen the other layers? How do we build policies? How do we build platforms? How do we build spaces that are protective and centered around truth? Part of it has to come down to us contributing in positive ways.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time now. If anyone has a further question, maybe you could stop by a couple of moments after today's talk. Before we thank our visitor, I'd like to let you know about a few more events coming up shortly. We will have events on the roots of Christian nationalism. We'll have another one on the interaction between controversies between policy and environmental science. And then we'll be concluding our series on disinformation with an elections and disinformation panel, and that will be on the 22nd of April. Then we'll probably be finishing our series of talks this year with something on the Middle East. It'll be Lawrence Pintack, the founding dean of the College of Communication, coming to talk about that, and that'll be on the 23rd of April. But now, please join me in thanking Professor Vraga for a really interesting